This is our cell energetics modeling project. So starting with photosynthesis, the reactants for photosynthesis are carbon dioxide plus water, which turn into the products glucose and oxygen. The light-dependent reaction. So that equation is H2O plus light turns into oxygen plus NADPH plus ATP. Enzymes split water into H plus and O2 as well as electrons. Using energy from sunlight, photosystem 2 energizes these electrons and transport them into an electron transport chain. Along the chain, electrons lose energy because they pump H plus ions. At photosystem 1, the electrons are energized and transferred to another electron transport chain, NADP plus, producing NADPH. Meanwhile, H plus ions accumulate, and the difference in charge and H plus concentration produce energy to make ATP. O2 is released. Underneath, you can see the diagram of the chloroplast. As you can see, there's the thylakoid discs, and one stack of these discs is called the granum. The stroma is the green fluid in between these granum, and the thylakoid space, as you can see, is in orange in the thylakoids.
So on the right, we have the light-independent reactions. The equation is CO2 plus NADPH plus ATP, which turns into C6H12O6 plus ADP and NADP plus. The light-independent reactions, also known as the Calvin cycle, uses 6 molecules of carbon dioxide to produce a single 6-carbon sugar molecule. Energy from ATP and high-energy electrons are used to convert the 3 carbon molecules to high-energy forms. So in the middle, you can see the whole diagram of photosynthesis with the light-dependent and light-independent reactions together. So a summary of this is the process of photosynthesis begins with water, light, and atmospheric carbon dioxide within the thylakoid membrane. These reactants are transformed into NADPH and ATP. These products are then used to synthesize high-energy sugars such as glucose. This process intakes CO2, H2O, and sunlight, and outputs oxygen and glucose.
On to cellular respiration. Below, you can see the equation for cellular respiration is glucose plus oxygen is turned into carbon dioxide, water, and ATP energy. On the left, there is the mitochondria diagram. So the components of this diagram are the mitochondrial matrix, the ATP synthase particles, the intermembrane space there in the light green, the inner membrane, the outer membrane, and the ribosomes. Anaerobic respiration, which occurs in the cytoplasm, takes place in 2 different circumstances, glycolysis and fermentation. During glycolysis, a glucose molecule is converted to 2 molecules of pyruvic acid. 2 net ATP are also created during the process. The pyruvic acid molecules are then sent to the Krebs cycle. In fermentation, when an organism lacks oxygen, fermentation releases energy from food molecules to produce ATP. There are 2 types of fermentation, alcoholic fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. Alcoholic fermentation intakes pyruvic acid and NADH to produce ethyl alcohol, carbon dioxide and NAD+. Lactic acid fermentation also intakes pyruvic acid and NADH and outputs lactic acid and NAD+.
So in the middle, there's the diagram of aerobic respiration. The equation for this is C6H12O6, and it turns into 2CH5OH plus 2CO2 plus ATP. After glycolysis, the next stage of cellular respiration is the Krebs cycle. In this stage, the pyruvic acid produced in the previous stage is used to produce citric acid, transform NAD plus to NADH, and transform FAD to FADH2. This process takes place in the mitochondrial matrix and releases carbon dioxide as a byproduct. After the Krebs cycle, the final stage of cellular respiration occurs. This process is known as the electron transport chain, or chemiosmosis. Chemiosmosis takes place in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. This process uses the hydrogen ions and electrons from NADH and FADH2 alongside oxygen to produce ATP. It does this by using particles known as ATP synthase. ATP synthase allows protons to pass through, and it uses the energy difference to convert ADP to ATP. In the center, you can see the whole process of photosynthesis, stage 1, 2, and 3, and below that, is how energy changes forms. Through photosynthesis, light reactions, light energy is used to excite electrons, and the energy from these electrons pumps H+ ions, which produces ATP. The electrons then help produce high-energy glucose molecules in the Calvin cycle. The energy is transferred to the glucose molecules. The energy is released when glucose is broken down in cellular respiration. Glucose is passed to heterotrophs through consumption. Glucose energy is used to produce ATP in glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, the ETC, and fermentation.
Thank you for listening.